The Reverend Deb Stanbury is a minister of the Presbyterian Church in Canada who has spent much of her ministry serving street-involved youth and vulnerable women. Deb was ordained in 2010 to the ministry work that she was doing at the Evergreen Center for Street Youth. Reverend Deb Stanbury served as executive director of Arise Ministry from its founding in 2013 until 2022. Arise offers hope to those involved in the sex trade through providing outreach, case management, and pastoral care. Deb has recently accepted a call to congregational ministry and is situated in Port Elgin, Ontario. She graduated from the Vancouver School of Theology and from Knox College with a Master's of Divinity and Masters of Theology. Thank you, Deb, for sharing today.
Thanks, Catherine. You could probably advance the slides deck. So what role does a lack of affordable housing options and support play for people facing domestic violence? Well, it's a contributing factor to why someone might be staying in an abusive and violent situation. If their only other option is homelessness, they're going to stay longer than they otherwise might. There's a lack of safe and affordable housing. In many market rent situations, there's a need for a credit check, and financial abuse might mean that either the person has no credit or they have bad credit. And so when a landlord asks for a credit check, it can be an immediate barrier. Having money for first and last month's rent, which is usually required in most market rent situations anyways, is nearly impossible when you're fleeing an abusive situation. To come up with the funds available for that comes with impossible risks. The shelter system is often at capacity, it's overburdened, it might not be safe for some people, or it might mean a fear of the involvement of child and family services. There's a difference between women's shelters and violence against women's shelters in many places, although in smaller communities, this differentiation may not be as clear or as obvious. And shelters come with rules, curfews. There can be concerns about other people knowing your business, other residents. Will you get along with them? There can be fights in shelters that can make residents already fleeing unsafe situations feel even more unsafe. There can be concerns, as I mentioned, about having shelter staff or other residents call child and family services on you if you have kids and having your kids apprehended. There can be long waits for affordable housing. Even if someone qualifies for special priority status for someone fleeing abuse, housing wait lists are long. They can be months long, they can be years long in some places. And so those are some of the real challenges that means for people facing domestic violence. Can you advance? Thanks. So what are some of the barriers to safe and affordable housing? Well, first of all, a lack of it. It can feel like searching for unicorns to find housing that is safe, affordable, and available. Trying to find this for someone in both kind of market rent or subsidized also can just feel like searching for a unicorn. What's available is not safe, and what's safe is not affordable. So that's a huge barrier. Now, housing forms and criteria can sometimes show a lack of awareness or understanding about the nature of abuse. The process assumes often that abuse ends with separation or the end of cohabitation. There was someone Arise worked with whose ex-partner knew where she lived and was sending her threatening text messages on a regular basis, but she didn't qualify for a transfer or special priority housing because they had not resided together for a set amount of time. But that didn't change the violence in her life or the potential for violence in her life. Barriers in the process itself. The process asks for proof of cohabitation. And if the abusive party has set everything up in their own name, or maybe they are residing somewhere where they're the only name on the lease, the person might not have a lease to show that has both parties' names on it. Or they might not have any bill or other meaningful document that would prove cohabitation. Social isolation that often happens in abuse might mean that there are actually very few people who could attest to their cohabitation and to the violence in the relationship. The priority status and refusal. In Toronto, people need to say what buildings they would be willing to live in, which means either spending hours at the computer looking through and checking off the different buildings, or going downtown and meeting with a housing worker. Both come with risks when your actions are being controlled by an abuser. But if you're shown 3 apartments and you refuse them because they don't feel safe to you, you are moved to the end of the list and you lose your priority status. And so then you can spend years waiting or having to reapply. Thanks. So what are some options to removing barriers for safe, affordable housing? Well, to raise awareness within your community. Have you tried to look for safe, affordable housing in your community? Have you done a housing search? Do you know what's available? Do other community members and church members have an awareness of this? When the only people who know that there is a problem in your community are housing seekers, support services, and housing providers, that's not enough to create meaningful change. You can advocate for it. Tell people of the need. Ask your politicians and community leaders what they're doing around this. Go to town halls, meet the candidate meetings, ask questions, write to your politicians, write to your local paper, spread the news. Challenge the policies and practices around housing priority. Look up what the forms say. Who do they serve? What barriers do you see? And how can you ask for change around this? Support existing organizations and community groups in meaningful ways. What organizations exist in your community that are working around this? How can you individually support them? How can your church support them? And maybe what they're looking for is board members or volunteers. And so there might be some ways for you to get involved. You can create it. Some churches have gone about creating affordable housing. The church may partner with the municipality or other organizations around this and may need to be aware of what criteria is being placed around this housing, but creating more affordable housing options in the community is, in my mind, always helpful. And maybe having an emergency housing fund. This might be a congregational effort, a presbytery effort, a ministerial effort, a denominational fund that could support someone fleeing abuse with the money needed for first and last month's rent or other housing needs. There's a church-based organization that I got to know a little bit through my work with Arise that had a fund for money to survivors of human trafficking that people could apply for. So perhaps there's an opportunity to think creatively and create something similar. All right, so what role can the church play? That's the next slide. So we can recognize, I think, first of all, the unhelpful role that we have played with respect to domestic violence. The teachings of the church may have implicitly or explicitly contributed to continuing the abuse. We need to recognize our blind spots. We'll talk more about this in the next slide, but there are some major blind spots that the church has when thinking about domestic violence and abuse that we need to recognize and wrestle with. we need to, we can create options. Deciding to leave an abusive relationship or abusive situation often involves planning. Whether the person is ready to leave or not, there can be steps taken to provide greater options for the person. Things like creating a separate bank account, having a safety deposit box to keep copies of their important documents, opening a PO box so that they have a safe mailing address, setting up a voicemail service, building a resume, and looking for employment are all things that empower the person and give them greater options, whether they're ready to leave the domestic violence situation or not. Housing applications. Ministers can be one of the professionals that confirm the abuse and cohabitation in many jurisdictions. If we are doing this, be very careful about using the church address and phone number on these forms, as often these are not confidential. There might be many people checking the church voicemail or checking the mail at the church. And so if you're helping to apply around that, just be really mindful of confidentiality. Looking at things through a feminist and or trauma-informed lens. What are we saying at weddings, at baptisms, in Bible studies, from the pulpit around forgiveness, around suffering, around marriage, around divorce? How do we need to maybe look at this through both a feminist and a trauma-informed lens and start to kind of parse out and think about some of the wording we use and what we say and how that might land for someone who is experiencing domestic violence. And then being a circle of support. We'll get into this a little further in a future slide, but the biggest aspect of this is believing the abused person wholeheartedly and 100%. All right, so checking our blind spots. Christy Kozad-Nuger, in her book, Counseling Women, which was published in 2001, wrote, "Pastors on the whole have not been very helpful to women and children who have experienced abuse in their families. Most studies about the usefulness of clergy in situations of abuse find that they are rated as both the least used and least helpful resource compared to family, friends, psychotherapists, family doctors, and social service agencies." And that was written in 2001. And so we hope that some things have changed, but I think it's important to be mindful that that was certainly the research then, and it likely may hold true still. Spiritual abuse. So thinking about how the teachings of the church have perhaps been used by the abuser. Things like turn the other cheek, what our church and statements might say about forgiveness, about obedience, about suffering, and the ways that that may have been co-opted or weaponized. The church's teachings on marriage, implicit and explicit teachings about marriage and the nuclear family might contribute when the church caters its programs and ministries to married couples and the nuclear family. There can be questions around shame and belonging within the church when considering separation from an abusive partner. Denial, silencing, and siding with the abuser. The church historically has participated in the silencing of victims of abuse. The perpetrator may have a very charismatic public persona. They often do. And they want to be liked in the public space. And so they may have positions of power and authority in their church, serving as a board member or an elder. And when we hear a story of abuse, if it runs counter to our experience of the individual, we may try to deny it. Christy Kozad-Nuger writes, it's it's usually more difficult for us to side against a person whom we wish to believe is innocent of this kind of behavior than it is to believe the accusation is a lie. Confidentiality in a public space. It can feel to an abused person, coming to church can feel like being a sitting duck, wondering, will my abuser show up at my church? Do I have to participate in the church photo directory? Is my contact information being shared? Do I get a say in who my elder is? Does my elder really need to know where I live? What happens if that really friendly, really chatty member of my church sees my abuser in the supermarket? Sometimes the support can feel conditional in church settings. Is our help conditional on the person attending church? Is it conditional on the person being ready to leave their abuser? Because these aren't really support. And then thinking about the clergy family, recognizing that abuse can and does happen within clergy families. And when it does, the church, if not an active participant in the abuse, is often complacent in it. When this abuse happens within the church, our first response is usually denial. And we need to think about the expectations we have of clergy and of their spouses, and what expectations we place on their children. How we support clergy mental health and self-care matters. And this can get even more complicated when the family home is the church's manse. So just checking some of our blind spots around that. So what does it mean to be a circle of support? This comes from Jill Corey and Karen McCandless Davis's book, When Love Hurts. And they set up a criteria for someone who's being abused to evaluate the support systems in their life and whether or not it's a circle of support. So the first criteria is, do they believe me 100% of the time? So this is one of the most important aspects of trauma care and supporting the person who's in a domestic violence situation, is believing them. Your belief in them shows them that they are believable and helps them to believe in themselves. The second criteria, are they concerned about my emotional and physical well-being more than they are concerned about my partner or the relationship? The passing comments that we sometimes make in church can cause harm. If there's a focus on how divorce is against God's plan, how it must be so hard for the abuser to not see their children, or vice versa, or how the kids are acting out so much because of the separation, when in actuality they are acting out because, or one of the reasons they may be acting out is because they finally feel safe enough to do so. A third criteria, are they trustworthy? Do I know that they will respect the confidentiality of what I tell them? And that goes back to some of those questions above about how confidentiality is being kept and by who in the church. And I think also recognizing the difference between secrecy and confidentiality, and being really upfront about our leading with care policy in the ways that we are talking with people. And then the fourth criteria, do they emphasize my strengths and affirm me? So sometimes people might feel like they're only being affirmed within the context of their relationships, being affirmed as being a good wife or a good partner, a good mother. Comments like, oh, what a lovely family you have, or how lucky your partner is. That's not really affirmation of affirming the person for who they are and their strengths, compared to, you give such wonderful insights in a Bible study. You have such creative ideas and contributions that you bring to the Sunday school. You have such strong leadership that you bring to the board or session. So I think being mindful about the ways that we affirm one another in church, what the comments are that we make, and how we might be affirming someone. And then the fifth criteria, are they dependable? Can I rely on them to be reasonably available when I need them? A person looking for help from the church or their pastor may test the waters first. They might ask for a meeting with their minister and then be almost unclear about what the meeting's about or what help they're looking for, because they're trying to figure out dependability and whether or not it's safe enough to disclose. And deciding to leave takes time and planning. And there can be this question of, when I'm ready, will you be there? So if you're working with someone on developing a safety plan or an escape plan, you better be willing to be there to help them execute it. And so that's what I have for us today. And we can get into our breakout groups and think about some questions.